There is no surviving record of when fear first took hold of Mike Tyson. No diary entry, no witness statement, no photograph that captures the moment when silence became heavier than noise. The streets of Brownsville were documented in crime statistics and newspaper headlines, yet the inner world of a child moving through them remains largely absent. Violence was counted, arrests were logged, but the long nights, the constant vigilance, the quiet calculations of survival, those details dissolved before they could be written down. This absence matters, because without it, something essential is missing from the story we think we know. What happens to a mind shaped by danger long before it understands language for safety? Brownsville, Brooklyn, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was a place where sound never fully slept. Sirens cut through the air at irregular intervals. Arguments rose and fell behind thin apartment walls. Footsteps in stairwells carried meaning. To live there was to learn early that stillness could be as important as speed, that noticing mattered. You did not need someone to explain this to you. The environment taught it relentlessly. Mike Tyson was born into this atmosphere in 1966, one of several children in a household where stability was fragile and often temporary. His father was absent. His mother struggled. These facts are recorded. What is less visible is how a child's nervous system adapts when unpredictability becomes routine, when safety is not assumed but negotiated moment by moment. As we listen closely to this early chapter, it becomes clear that the usual language of success and failure does not apply yet. There is no destiny forming in obvious ways. There is only adaptation. A small body learning how to occupy space without drawing too much attention. A mind learning patterns before it learns trust. Brownsville did not ask permission to shape its children. It pressed itself into them quietly through repetition, through mornings when the air felt tense before anything had happened, through afternoons where play and threat shared the same sidewalk, through nights when sleep was light, ready to break. Later biographies would describe Tyson as violent, volatile, explosive. But these words arrive much too late. They describe outcomes, not origins. In these early years, what emerges first is not aggression, but vulnerability. A boy who is physically smaller than many others. A boy who is targeted. A boy who learns, painfully, that being gentle offers little protection in certain environments. There is a gap here in the historical record. We know Tyson was bullied. We know he was often afraid. But fear, when chronic, does not always look dramatic. It looks like watchfulness. It looks like retreat. It looks like learning when to disappear and when to stand still. You can imagine him walking through Brownsville, not yet as a fighter, but as an observer, noticing who controls which corners, which streets feel safe at which hours, which faces signal trouble. This is a form of education rarely acknowledged, yet it is rigorous. It teaches anticipation. It teaches reading between movements. It teaches the cost of mistakes. One detail from these years appears again and again in accounts. Pigeons. Mike Tyson's early affection for pigeons is often mentioned as a curious footnote, but perhaps it deserves more attention. Caring for pigeons requires patience. It requires gentleness. It offers companionship without threat. In a place where trust is risky, animals become anchors. They respond consistently. They do not deceive. When those pigeons were killed by older boys, something shifted. This event is sometimes framed as a spark that ignited Tyson's violence. But that framing is too simple. What may have occurred instead is a lesson about loss, about the fragility of things that offer comfort, about how quickly safety can be taken away. Violence in this context does not appear as a desire for domination. It appears as a response to grief that has nowhere to go. As a language learned when other languages fail, when vulnerability is punished, hardness becomes protective. Yet even this transformation is incomplete. Tyson did not immediately become feared. He became reactive. Arrests followed. Trouble accumulated. The juvenile system noticed him before any trainer did. These encounters with authority are recorded as disciplinary moments, but they also represent something else. Repeated confirmations that the world responds to force more reliably than to need. Still, nothing here is inevitable. That is another gap in the story often overlooked. Many children experience hardship without becoming legends of destruction or power. The difference lies not in suffering alone, but in how suffering is interpreted and guided. At this point in Tyson's life, guidance is largely absent. There is no consistent adult translating fear into meaning, no structure capable of containing his intensity. And so the intensity spills outward, not yet refined, not yet controlled, simply raw. This is where the mystery deepens. Because when we look back, knowing what Mike Tyson would become, it is tempting to see these early years as obvious preparation. But lived experience does not feel that way. It feels uncertain, fragmented, unresolved. If you sit with this moment long enough, you begin to sense that the story has not yet chosen a direction. The boy in Brownsville is not yet a boxer, not yet a symbol. He is a question still forming. What happens next will depend on interruption, on the arrival of something or someone capable of translating fear into discipline, chaos into ritual. Without that interruption, this story might dissolve quietly into statistics like so many others from the same streets. History remembers outcomes. It rarely lingers on thresholds, but this early silence, this undocumented shaping of a mind, may be the most important part of all. Because before Mike Tyson learned how to strike, he learned how to survive. And survival, when practiced long enough, becomes instinct. The question that remains, hovering gently at the edge of this first chapter, is not how strong he would become, but what kind of strength the world was preparing him to need. When fear settles into the body early, it does not announce itself. It does not arrive as panic or memory. It becomes posture. It becomes timing. It becomes the way you enter a room and the way you leave it. In the years following his first encounters with loss and humiliation, Mike Tyson did not yet move toward violence with intention. He moved away from vulnerability. Brownsville continued to teach its lessons without pause. The streets did not change their rhythm to accommodate a child's confusion. School offered little refuge. Authority appeared inconsistent, sometimes absent, sometimes overwhelming. In such conditions, attention sharpens while trust erodes. You learn to read faces quickly. You learn which silences are safe and which are warnings. Tyson's small stature in these years mattered. Before the power, before the reputation, his body did not command respect. It attracted challenge. Bullying was not a single event, but a pattern, repeated often enough to feel structural. The body absorbs these patterns. It learns where pain arrives from. It begins to anticipate harm before it happens. This anticipation is exhausting. It keeps the nervous system alert long after danger has passed. Over time, it demands resolution. Either the world becomes less threatening, or the self becomes harder. For Tyson, the world did not soften. There is a temptation in retrospect to frame what followed as a choice, to say that aggression was selected over gentleness. But lived experience rarely presents options so cleanly. What often happens instead is narrowing. Certain responses stop working, others remain. The range of possible reactions contracts until what remains feels inevitable. Fighting at first was not about winning. It was about stopping something, about interrupting the cycle of humiliation, about reclaiming a sense of agency, however brief. When Tyson fought back, the world responded differently. Pain shifted direction. Fear redistributed itself. This is an important moment to sit with quietly. Violence did not emerge from cruelty. It emerged from relief, from the sudden cessation of being targeted, from the body's realization that force could create space where none had existed before. That realization leaves a mark. Arrests followed. Truancy. Encounters with the juvenile system that framed behavior as delinquency rather than communication. These records tell us what happened, but not what it meant. They do not capture the internal logic forming beneath the surface. A logic shaped by repeated feedback. Strength interrupts harm. Hesitation invites it. At the same time, something else was happening. Tyson's intelligence, often overlooked, was finding informal channels. He learned quickly. He watched patterns. He adapted. This adaptability is not accidental. It is honed under pressure. When environments are unstable, flexibility becomes survival. And yet, adaptability without guidance can turn inward. It can magnify extremes. Tyson's responses grew sharper, more volatile. Without structure, intensity does not dissipate. It accumulates. The pigeons return here quietly. They remain a detail that resists easy explanation. In caring for them, Tyson practiced something that did not translate well to the street. Patience without immediate reward. Attention without threat. When that fragile sanctuary was destroyed, the lesson was reinforced. Softness is temporary. Attachment is dangerous. These are not beliefs formed through reflection. They are conclusions drawn through repetition. As we follow this period, it becomes harder to separate environment from individual. Brownsville was not merely a backdrop. It was an active participant. Its constraints shaped behavior. Its dangers filtered out certain possibilities. What survived were strategies that worked quickly and decisively. The juvenile system, intended as correction, often intensified this narrowing. Confinement teaches its own lessons. Hierarchies form. Reputation matters. Displays of weakness carry cost. The body learns to project readiness even when exhausted. Still, even here, the story does not harden completely. There are moments of hesitation. Accounts suggest Tyson was not a constant aggressor. He could be withdrawn, moody, silent. These qualities complicate the caricature that would later define him. Silence, in particular, becomes significant. It is often misread as emptiness. But silence can also be a holding space, a place where conflicting impulses wait, where the self has not yet settled into a single shape. This is the threshold the historical record rarely lingers on, the space between victim and fighter, between fear and dominance. It is an uncomfortable space because it resists narrative clarity. There is no clean arc here, only tension. By the time Tyson was sent to the Tryon School for Boys, the pattern seemed established. Trouble followed him. The future appeared constrained. Many stories end here, quietly, with potential unfulfilled and paths foreclosed. But history sometimes hinges on interruptions. Tryon was not gentle, but it was different. Removed from the immediate pressures of Brownsville, new rhythms emerged. New adults appeared. Some noticed what others had missed. Not just volatility, but focus. Not just aggression, but discipline waiting for direction. It is here, in this pause between environments, that the story begins to bend. Still, nothing is resolved. Tyson did not suddenly become calm or compliant. The same intensity remained, the same fear-driven vigilance. What changed was proximity. He was now close enough to something that could contain him, though neither he nor the system yet recognized it. As we linger at the edge of this moment, it becomes clear that the next chapter will not be about talent discovered in isolation. It will be about translation, about whether fear can be taught a different language, whether power can be ritualized rather than unleashed. The boy who leaves Brownsville is not leaving his conditioning behind. He carries it with him, embedded in muscle and reflex. The question that quietly unfolds is not whether he will change, but who will be allowed to shape the change. Because without guidance, intensity consumes itself, and with the wrong guidance, it becomes something far more dangerous. Somewhere ahead, still unseen, is a man who believes fear can be mastered rather than avoided. A man who will look at Tyson not as a problem to be fixed, but as raw material to be formed. Whether that meeting will save him or simply refine the force already growing inside remains unresolved. And so we move forward gently into a place where silence will meet instruction and chaos will be invited into structure without yet knowing the cost of that invitation. There are moments in a life that feel insignificant when they occur, yet later reveal themselves as turning points so sharp they divide time in two. They do not announce their importance. They slip in quietly, often disguised as routine. For Mike Tyson, such a moment arrived not with applause or revelation, but with observation. At the Tryon School for Boys, days followed a schedule that was neither kind nor cruel. It simply existed. For someone accustomed to chaos, this predictability was disorienting. The body, trained to anticipate sudden threat, does not relax easily when silence replaces noise. It waits for interruption. It braces. Tyson spent much of this time withdrawn. He watched more than he spoke. His energy, so disruptive elsewhere, had nowhere obvious to go. It pooled. It pressed inward. Staff members noticed his volatility, but also something else, harder to define. When focused, he focused completely. When instructed, he listened, if the instruction felt precise. This is where Bobby Stewart enters the historical record, though his arrival carries none of the grandeur later myth would assign it. He was a counselor, a former boxer, someone who recognized familiar shapes in unfamiliar places. Stewart did not see Tyson as a problem to suppress. He saw an excess to be directed. The first lessons were simple: stance, balance, breath. Not power, but control. Tyson's body responded immediately, as if relieved to find a container, Movements that once erupted now had sequence. Aggression became repetition. Fear became fuel. Boxing, in this context, was not violence. It was permission. It offered rules where none had existed, boundaries that could be trusted, pain that arrived predictably. For someone shaped by unpredictability, this mattered more than strength. Stewart insisted on discipline beyond the ring. Schoolwork became non-negotiable. Respect, not dominance, was the measure of progress. These demands were not arbitrary, they were structural. They taught that power without restraint was incomplete. Tyson absorbed this quickly, perhaps too quickly. The same intensity that once magnified his volatility now accelerated his learning. He trained obsessively. He memorized fights. He studied technique with a hunger that bordered on reverence. Yet even here, something unsettled remained. Stewart was not a permanent figure. Systems shift, people move on. And when Stewart recognized that Tyson's growth was exceeding what he could safely manage, he made a decision that would alter the trajectory of boxing history. He introduced Tyson to Cus D'Amato. The significance of this introduction cannot be overstated, yet it must be approached carefully. D'Amato was not merely a trainer. He was a philosopher of fear, a man who believed that fear was not an obstacle to greatness, but its necessary companion. Where Stewart provided structure, D'Amato offered meaning. Cus D'Amato's presence was unusual. His speech was deliberate, his ideas repetitive, almost hypnotic. He spoke often of fear, of courage, of inevitability. He framed boxing not as sport, but as psychological warfare. The opponent was not simply across the ring, he was within. For Tyson, this language resonated deeply. It named sensations he had lived with but never articulated. Fear was no longer an embarrassment to conceal. It was a force to harness. D'Amato's training extended beyond punches. He reshaped Tyson's identity through narrative. He told him he was destined for greatness, that he would become the youngest heavyweight champion in history. These declarations were not predictions, they were scripts, and Tyson, who had grown up without stable narratives, accepted them fully. Here, the line between guidance and imprinting begins to blur. D'Amato adopted Tyson both legally and psychologically. He removed him from environments that threatened distraction. He isolated him. Training intensified. Social life narrowed. Boxing became not an activity, but a world view. This immersion produced astonishing results. Tyson's physical development accelerated. His technique refined. His presence became intimidating before he threw a punch. The ring transformed into a place where fear could be controlled, even reversed. But immersion has consequences. When identity fuses completely with role, flexibility diminishes. Doubt becomes dangerous. Alternative selves wither. D'Amato's philosophy allowed little room for ambiguity. Tyson was to be unstoppable. Anything less was failure. This binary thinking, victory or collapse, mirrored the survival logic of Tyson's early life. In this sense, boxing did not replace his conditioning. It amplified it, refined it, gave it legitimacy. Still, in these years, the system worked. Tyson's amateur career was meteoric. Victories piled up. Opponents faltered before contact. The narrative held. The prophecy appeared to fulfill itself. Observers marveled at his discipline, his ferocity, his focus. Few questioned the cost of such singular devotion. Fewer still asked what might happen if the structure supporting him disappeared. D'Amato was aging, his health declined, and when he died in 1985, Tyson was only 18. The loss was profound, though often understated in public accounts. D'Amato had been more than a trainer. He had been a psychological anchor. His presence regulated Tyson's fear, giving it direction and meaning. Without him, the system that contained Tyson's intensity weakened, yet success continued. Perhaps because momentum carries its own force. Perhaps because the identity D'Amato installed remained active, even without its originator. But identities built under pressure do not dissolve quietly. They crack. As Tyson transitioned into professional boxing, surrounded by managers, promoters, expectations, and wealth, the question that lingered was not whether he could dominate opponents. It was whether he could survive himself without the voice that had taught him how to fear productively. The story, at this point, does not darken yet. It glows, triumphs loom, records await. But beneath the surface, the architecture that held Tyson together has begun to shift. And as we move forward, the silence left by D'Amato's absence grows louder. Because fear, when unstructured, does not disappear. It looks for a new shape, and whether that shape will be discipline or destruction remains an open question, waiting just beyond the next victory. Success arrived before reflection had time to form. It moved quickly, carried by momentum that felt less like progress and more like inevitability. Mike Tyson stepped into the professional ring as though continuing a sentence already spoken long before. The crowds saw power. The record books saw efficiency. But beneath the spectacle, something quieter was happening, something structural, almost invisible. Without Cus D'Amato, the philosophy remained, but the presence that enforced it did not. The voice that once guided fear into precision had gone silent. In its place emerged many voices, none with the same authority, each offering direction without containment. Trainers adjusted technique, managers arranged fights, promoters amplified the image. No one replaced the role of inner restraint. And yet the victories kept coming. Opponents fell quickly. Some barely lasted a round. Commentators struggled to find language adequate to describe what they were witnessing. Tyson did not fight like other heavyweights. He compressed time. He erased expectation. His movements were compact, relentless, rehearsed to the point of inevitability. This style did not emerge spontaneously. It was the culmination of years of disciplined repetition, forged under a philosophy that treated fear as raw material. But repetition, when detached from reflection, can become automatic, and automation does not ask questions. By the time Tyson faced Trevor Berbick in 1986, the weight of history had already begun to tilt. Berbick was the reigning heavyweight champion, but the outcome felt predetermined. When the fight ended in the second round, Tyson became the youngest heavyweight champion in history. The prophecy had fulfilled itself. The world responded as it always does to dominance, with awe, with celebration, with simplification. Tyson was framed as unstoppable, as an elemental force, as proof that discipline, when combined with talent, produces inevitability. The narrative rarely lingered on the fragility beneath this image. It did not ask how such intensity was sustained or what it required in silence. Inside the ring, Tyson was precise. Outside it, structure thinned. Money arrived faster than identity could adjust. Fame altered social gravity. New relationships formed without shared history. Old habits resurfaced, no longer constrained by institutional oversight. The boundaries that boxing provided inside the ring did not automatically extend beyond it. This distinction mattered. D'Amato had once insisted that discipline must govern all aspects of life, that the mind does not recognize compartments, that fear, if indulged in one area, leaks into others. Without this philosophy actively enforced, Tyson's life began to separate. Training here, indulgence there. Still, the system appeared functional. Tyson defended his title repeatedly. Each fight reinforced the myth. Opponents arrived already diminished by reputation. The psychological warfare D'Amato had described played out visibly. Fear arrived before contact. Fights ended quickly. But myths demand consistency. They allow little room for fluctuation. They punish vulnerability. Behind the scenes, Tyson's relationships grew unstable. Advisors conflicted. Loyalty blurred. The sense of isolation, once mitigated by purpose, returned in subtler forms. Surrounded by people, he remained alone. There is a pattern here, one not unique to Tyson. When individuals rise rapidly within rigid narratives, their internal worlds often lag behind their external roles. The self becomes performance. Maintenance replaces growth. Tyson's public image suggested control. His private reality suggested drift. Incidents began to surface. Arguments, impulsive decisions, legal concerns. Each one was addressed individually, framed as anomaly rather than signal. The system absorbed them as long as victories continued, and they did. Tyson unified the heavyweight titles, defeating champions who represented different sanctioning bodies. His dominance appeared complete. The ring, once a place of transformation, became confirmation. Yet confirmation can dull awareness. Training intensity fluctuated. Focus waned. Routine, once sacred, became negotiable. The fear that once sharpened discipline now sought other outlets. Without containment, it expressed itself as restlessness. Observers noticed subtle changes, longer rounds, less precision, moments of impatience. These were not defeats, but deviations. The myth absorbed them without adjustment. But systems that do not correct early drift eventually face larger ruptures. Tyson's personal life grew increasingly chaotic. Relationships fractured. Trust eroded. The sense of being misunderstood, once alleviated by achievement, returned with force. The ring could no longer contain everything. This is not a moral story. It is a structural one. When identity is built around dominance, vulnerability becomes intolerable. When vulnerability is suppressed, it emerges sideways. The very intensity that once fueled greatness begins to destabilize it. Still, Tyson remained champion. Still, the world watched in awe. And perhaps that was part of the problem. There were moments when intervention might have mattered, when reflection could have been encouraged, when recalibration might have preserved coherence. But success discourages interruption. It insists on continuity. Then came a fight that would alter perception. Buster Douglas was not expected to win. The narrative allowed him little space. He was framed as obstacle, not possibility. Yet on that night in Tokyo, the structure failed. Douglas resisted intimidation. He endured. He adapted. Tyson, unaccustomed to prolonged uncertainty, struggled. When the fight ended in the 10th round, the result stunned the world. The myth fractured. This defeat did not simply remove a title. It exposed a gap, the absence of structure that had once guided fear into discipline. Without that structure, pressure accumulated until performance collapsed. The aftermath was disorienting. Explanations multiplied. Training lapses, distractions, underestimation, all contained partial truth. But deeper than any tactical error was the question of internal regulation. What happens when the system that shaped greatness dissolves, and nothing replaces it? Tyson's loss to Douglas was not the end of his career, but it marked the end of inevitability. The narrative could no longer sustain itself without revision, and as the next chapter unfolds, the question lingers, not about titles or records, but about containment. Can intensity survive without structure, or does it eventually consume the very force that once gave it purpose? That question waits, unresolved, as the story moves forward into territory where victory is no longer guaranteed and silence becomes harder to manage. After the loss, the world did not go quiet. It grew louder. Explanations overlapped, each one competing to close the rupture as quickly as possible. Fatigue, distraction, underestimation, a bad night. These answers moved easily because they required nothing to change. They allowed the story to continue as before, with only a temporary interruption. Inside Tyson, the silence was different. The defeat in Tokyo had not arrived as pain alone. It arrived as disorientation. For the first time since adolescence, the ring had not obeyed expectation. The rituals had not produced the promised result. Fear, once transmuted into motion, had lingered without direction. The structure that once converted uncertainty into certainty had failed, and with it, the sense of inevitability that had protected him from reflection. Recovery began outwardly, as it often does. Training resumed, promises were made. The narrative shifted toward redemption. A rematch was discussed as though it were an administrative correction rather than an existential one. The loss was framed as error, not information. Yet the internal landscape had changed. Without the aura of invincibility, attention sharpened. The eyes watching him were no longer filled only with awe. Doubt appeared, quietly at first. Doubt does not announce itself loudly. It waits, observing how one responds. Tyson returned to the ring and began winning again. The power remained, the speed remained, the knockouts returned. On paper, the trajectory appeared restored. But restoration is not the same as repair. Between fights, life continued to fragment, relationships grew transactional, trust thinned, the absence of a central guiding voice became more apparent. Advice arrived in abundance, but coherence did not. Each voice spoke to outcome, not to integration. The discipline that once extended beyond boxing now existed only where boxing demanded it. Outside the gym, impulses found fewer barriers. The sense of containment that D'Amato had insisted upon, where the self is governed by a single philosophy, no longer held. This fragmentation mattered more than any tactical deficiency, because boxing at its highest levels is not only physical, it is a confrontation with uncertainty, prolonged and intimate. It demands patience as much as aggression, clarity as much as power. Without internal alignment, these qualities erode under pressure. Tyson's attempts at recentering were sincere but incomplete. Training camps were intense but inconsistent. Focus surged, then faded. The oscillation itself became exhausting. Public incidents multiplied. Each one was addressed in isolation, treated as aberration rather than pattern. The system around him, promoters, media, advisors, had little incentive to slow the machine. Momentum, once lost, had to be regained quickly, and so it was. In 1992, Tyson faced a challenge not from an opponent, but from the legal system. The accusation and subsequent conviction marked a rupture far deeper than any loss in the ring. This was not a contest governed by rules he understood. There was no strategy to apply, no physical outlet for tension. Prison imposed a different kind of structure. Time slowed, movement was restricted. The body, once in constant motion, was confined. The mind, deprived of distraction, turned inward. In this environment, reflection became unavoidable. Accounts from this period suggest moments of introspection alongside resistance. Tyson read. He studied religion. He exercised. He oscillated between discipline and defiance, mirroring the larger pattern of his life. The environment enforced routine but not meaning. Yet something shifted. When identity is stripped of performance, what remains becomes visible. Without crowds, without opponents, without immediate validation, the self encounters itself directly. This encounter is rarely comfortable. Tyson emerged from prison changed but not resolved. The body had been preserved. The power remained. But the question of integration lingered. The boxing world awaited his return with anticipation. Redemption narratives are powerful. They promise restoration without requiring transformation. Tyson once again stepped into this role. Victories followed. The knockouts returned. The audience roared. For a time it appeared that the arc had been corrected. Titles were reclaimed, status restored. But beneath the surface, tension accumulated. The discipline was still episodic, the containment incomplete, the internal narrative unresolved. Success returned, but coherence did not. This matters because when intensity lacks integration, it seeks expression, and when expression is blocked, it distorts. The infamous incident against Evander Holyfield would later be framed as madness, as moral failure, as inexplicable loss of control. But such framings obscure the gradual buildup that preceded it. They treat rupture as anomaly rather than culmination. By the time Tyson entered that ring, the weight he carried was not only physical. It was the accumulation of unresolved fear, fragmented identity, and the pressure to perform a myth no longer aligned with internal reality. When the act occurred, it shocked the world. But shock often reveals more about expectation than about cause. The question is not why something broke, but how long it had been bending. The aftermath was swift. Punishment followed. Condemnation arrived. The narrative shifted again from redemption to tragedy, from dominance to cautionary tale. Tyson became symbol rather than person. Explanations hardened, complexity thinned. Yet even here the story does not resolve, because beyond scandal and spectacle lies a deeper inquiry, one about systems that produce intensity without sustaining integration, about cultures that celebrate domination without teaching containment, about the cost of narratives that allow no space for vulnerability. Tyson's journey did not end with that moment. It continued, quieter, less visible. The next chapters would involve attempts at meaning beyond the ring, at coherence beyond performance. But the question remains, unresolved and persistent. What happens to a human shaped entirely for confrontation, when confrontation is no longer the organizing principle of life? And how does one learn to listen when the voice that once guided everything has been silent for years? That question does not answer itself quickly. It waits, moving with the story into a slower, more reflective terrain where outcomes matter less than understanding, and where the absence of applause reveals truths no crowd ever could. When the noise finally thinned, what remained was unfamiliar. Not emptiness exactly, but a different density of time. The days no longer moved toward a fight date, no longer curved toward a single night where everything would be decided. Without that gravitational center, life spread outward slower, less directional, harder to interpret. For someone shaped by anticipation, this was disorienting. The boxing world still spoke his name, but the tone had changed. Curiosity replaced reverence. Judgment replaced awe. The figure once treated as inevitable was now examined as fragile, erratic, incomplete. Reputation, once armored by fear, had become porous. Tyson felt this shift even when no words were spoken. Public spaces carried a different temperature. Faces no longer looked away. Silence followed him differently than before. Not the silence of intimidation, but the silence of observation. He returned to training, but training alone could no longer answer the deeper unease. Physical preparation had once been sufficient because it aligned with a unified inner narrative. Now, effort fragmented. Strength existed, but purpose wavered. The body remembers patterns even when the mind resists them. Movement in the ring still triggered instincts refined over decades. Yet instinct without conviction feels hollow. It responds but does not lead. Fights continued, though fewer now spoke of legacy. They spoke instead of survival. Each bout felt heavier, not because opponents were stronger, but because meaning had thinned. Victory no longer resolved tension. Loss no longer shocked. It confirmed what had already been suspected. Outside the ring, Tyson searched. Religion had offered structure during confinement, and fragments of that structure followed him into freedom. He explored belief systems, rituals, philosophies. Each offered language for suffering, explanations for chaos. Yet none fully integrated with the life he lived daily. Belief remained adjacent, not embedded. This gap mattered, because meaning that remains theoretical cannot stabilize action. It must be lived, repeated, embodied. Without this, belief becomes ornament rather than foundation. Relationships, too, struggle to find equilibrium. Fame distorts intimacy. Power attracts proximity without understanding. The lines between care and exploitation blur easily when vulnerability is unevenly distributed. Tyson's attempts at connection were sincere but often misaligned. Trust had been trained out of him early, replaced by vigilance. Vulnerability had been framed as weakness. Even now, moments of openness triggered reflexive retreat. The system around him still functioned on momentum. Promoters sought returns. Media sought narratives. Redemption arcs were recycled, regardless of whether the inner work had been done. Few paused to ask what kind of life was being sustained. In such environments, reflection becomes an act of resistance. As his boxing career declined, attention shifted elsewhere. Financial instability emerged, another shock for someone who had once generated wealth almost automatically. Money, like power, had arrived too quickly to be contextualized. Its disappearance carried lessons that arrived late and sharply. Without constant reinforcement, identity loosened. Who is one when not feared, not celebrated, not obeyed? This question surfaced quietly, often uninvited. It appeared in mundane moments, in empty rooms, in idle afternoons, in the absence of schedule. These spaces, once filled by training and anticipation, now demanded something else. Tyson began speaking more openly, sometimes recklessly, sometimes insightfully. Interviews became confessional. He named fear. He acknowledged damage. He admitted confusion. These admissions unsettled those who preferred clean narratives, because confession complicates myth. The public, accustomed to consuming simplified figures, struggled to place him. He was no longer simply villain or hero. He became something less marketable, human, fractured, searching. This transition is rarely comfortable. In cultures that reward certainty, uncertainty is treated as failure. But uncertainty is also where learning begins. Tyson's discomfort signaled not collapse but reorientation. The body that once expressed everything through violence now had to find other languages. Words replaced fists. Reflection replaced dominance. These substitutions were imperfect, sometimes awkward, but necessary. Gradually, new forms of discipline emerged. Not the absolute fear-driven control of D'Amato's era, but something looser, more negotiated. Exercise became maintenance rather than weaponization. Speech became exploration rather than performance. Still, the past lingered. Trauma does not disappear because circumstances change. It waits, resurfacing in moments of stress, in patterns of avoidance, in sudden emotional spikes. Tyson confronted this unevenly. Some days clarity arrived. Others returned him to familiar cycles. Yet even cycles change shape over time. As years passed, the boxing world moved on. New champions emerged. The era that had once revolved around him became historical reference. This distance created space for reinterpretation. Tyson began to reframe his own story, not as rise and fall, but as construction and consequence. He spoke about how early deprivation had shaped hunger, how sudden power had distorted self-perception, how systems had rewarded intensity without offering integration. These reflections did not absolve harm, they contextualized it. And context, when handled honestly, invites responsibility rather than evasion. He acknowledged that fear had been both tool and prison, that the image others feared had also constrained him, that living inside a myth leaves little room for growth. This acknowledgement marked a quiet turning. The question shifted from, "What did I lose?" to, "What can still be learned?" This is not a triumphant question. It does not promise restoration. It opens instead into uncertainty, into a slower process where answers emerge gradually, often indirectly. Tyson's later years would not resemble his early ones. They would not be defined by dominance or spectacle. They would involve conversation, storytelling, attempts at coherence. Some found this disappointing. Others found it necessary. Because stories that end with collapse teach little. Stories that continue beyond collapse into reflection offer something rarer: orientation. The life that follows intensity is often quieter, less dramatic, but more demanding. It requires patience rather than force, listening rather than command. Tyson was learning this terrain unevenly, imperfectly, in public view. There were missteps, there were regressions, but there was also persistence. And beneath it all remained the central inquiry, now stripped of urgency but not of weight. When the structures that once gave life meaning dissolve, what remains to organize the self? This question does not resolve in victory or defeat. It unfolds across time, in choices that rarely make headlines, in adjustments too subtle to celebrate. It continues quietly into the next phase of the story, where legacy is no longer inherited from performance, but shaped through understanding, and where the measure of strength begins to change. Time, once an adversary measured in rounds and seconds, softened into something less exact. It no longer counted down toward a bell. It expanded, stretched, sometimes stalled. For someone who had lived inside urgency, This new relationship with time felt uncertain, even suspicious. There was no longer a single path forward. Tyson's name still carried weight, but it now floated between contexts. To some, it belonged to history. To others, to scandal. To a growing number, it became a case study of trauma, of power, of what happens when a human being is turned into a symbol before becoming a self. This shift was subtle but decisive. He began appearing in spaces where violence was discussed rather than enacted. Interviews slowed, conversations deepened. He spoke less about technique and more about fear, loneliness, the way anger had once felt like clarity. Listeners heard something unfamiliar, not justification, but recognition. Recognition does not erase the past, it rearranges it. Tyson began to see patterns he had once mistaken for fate. The early chaos of Brownsville, the sudden order under D'Amato, the explosion of fame, the collapse. None of it seemed accidental anymore. Each phase followed the previous one logically, even if painfully. The myth of the unstoppable champion had depended on compression, on ignoring complexity in favor of force. But complexity always returns. It cannot be held down indefinitely. In quieter moments, Tyson reflected on the language that had shaped him. Words like destroy, dominate, annihilate. These had once felt empowering. Now they sounded narrow, even fragile. They left no room for nuance, no space for recovery. He began experimenting with different vocabularies. Humor emerged unexpectedly, dry and self-aware. It softened edges that violence once hardened. Laughter, unlike intimidation, invited connection without demand. This was not a reinvention for the public. It was an adjustment for survival. The body, too, demanded a new understanding. Years of punishment had left marks that could not be ignored. Pain became chronic rather than acute. Training transformed from preparation for battle into negotiation with limitation. Accepting limitation is not surrender. It is recalibration. Tyson began speaking openly about mental health, about depression, about substances once used to manage emptiness rather than pleasure. He did not frame these experiences as battles won or lost, but as conditions navigated unevenly. This refusal to dramatize recovery unsettled some. Redemption narratives prefer clean arcs. They require visible triumphs. Tyson offered instead something slower, messier, more realistic. He admitted to relapse, confusion, contradiction. These admissions broke the expectation that growth must be linear. Growth, he seemed to suggest, is recursive. Old impulses resurfaced under stress. Anger flared unexpectedly. Distrust reappeared in relationships. But now these moments were sometimes observed rather than obeyed. That distance, however small, mattered. The figure who once embodied inevitability now embodied inquiry. As new generations encountered him through clips, interviews, and memes, the image fragmented further. The younger Tyson became an artifact, astonishing, almost unreal. The older Tyson became a voice, reflective, occasionally amused by his former self. This duality created tension. Who is the real Tyson? The destroyer or the philosopher? The answer resisted simplicity. Both were real. Both emerged from the same conditions. Acknowledging this complexity did not resolve discomfort. It deepened it, because it raised questions larger than any one life. What responsibility do systems hold when they reward extremity without care? What happens when talent is extracted faster than identity can form? How many other figures followed similar paths without surviving long enough to reflect? Tyson's survival became in itself notable. Not survival as endurance, but survival as continuation into dialogue, into uncertainty, into redefinition. He became increasingly candid about exploitation, about how structures around him had benefited from his volatility while offering little protection. This was not accusation alone. It was observation. Observation shifts power subtly. As he spoke, others began to listen differently, not to be entertained, but to understand. The spectacle receded. The person emerged. This emergence did not erase harm done to others. Tyson did not claim that. Instead, he framed his story as caution rather than apology. He acknowledged victims. He acknowledged guilt. He did not seek absolution through explanation. This restraint marked a change. Public discourse around him softened, though never fully healed. Some wounds do not. But the tone shifted from fixation to contemplation. Tyson began participating in projects unrelated to boxing, acting, podcasting, commentary. These were not replacements for the ring. They were extensions. New ways to inhabit presence without violence. Speech replaced impact. In these spaces, he often returned to the same themes: fear of abandonment, hunger for structure, confusion between love and control. He traced these back not to single events but to atmospheres, environments where survival required hardness, where vulnerability carried risk. Understanding atmosphere rather than incident allowed broader insight, because many share similar atmospheres without becoming champions, criminals, or myths. Tyson's extremity magnified conditions that exist quietly elsewhere. This recognition expanded his story beyond biography. He became a lens through which to examine how society manufactures intensity, how it consumes it, and how little it invests in repair. The question of legacy began to surface more often, not legacy as titles or records, but as meaning. What does one leave behind when achievements are inseparable from damage? Tyson did not answer this directly. Instead, he continued speaking, listening, revisiting. Legacy, he seemed to accept, is not declared. It is interpreted over time, and time, once enemy, now collaborator. The further he moved from his peak, the more space there was to reframe it. Dominance became context rather than identity. Violence became symptom rather than essence. This reframing did not dilute responsibility. It redistributed understanding. As his voice matured, so did the silence around certain myths. The idea of the invincible champion lost credibility. In its place emerged a quieter, more troubling figure. A human being shaped by forces larger than himself, struggling to outgrow them. This struggle did not resolve neatly, but resolution was no longer the goal. The goal increasingly was coherence, to live without splitting, without dividing past from present, strength from vulnerability, harm from insight, to hold the whole story without collapsing under its weight. This is slow work. It does not produce highlights or headlines. It unfolds privately, imperfectly, often unseen. And yet it is here, in this understated phase, that the story deepens, because the question is no longer how far one can go, but how one continues when going further is no longer possible. That question remains open. It carries forward into the next chapter, where reflection meets responsibility, and where the meaning of survival begins to shift again, away from endurance alone, toward something quieter and harder to define. The public often imagines reflection as a quiet room, a chair, a single voice thinking its way toward clarity. But for Tyson, Reflection arrived noisily, in fragments, interrupted by memory, by regret, by the stubborn echo of instincts that had once kept him alive. Silence did not come easily. Even when the world slowed, the internal pace remained uneven. Old scenes replayed without invitation. Faces, moments, decisions surfaced without chronology. Reflection, he learned, was not a retreat from the past. It was an encounter with it. This encounter brought an uncomfortable realization. Many of the choices he had believed were his own had been shaped long before he was aware of choosing. Environments had trained reactions. Praise had reinforced behaviors. Fear had narrowed options until aggression felt like freedom. Understanding this did not absolve him. It complicated him. Complication is rarely welcomed. It resists slogans. It refuses neat conclusions. But it offers something more durable than judgment. Perspective. Tyson began speaking less in absolutes. The language of certainty, once so natural, gave way to qualifiers, pauses, reconsiderations. These pauses mattered. They signaled a shift from performance to presence. Presence is not passive, it requires attention. As he revisited his own history, he noticed how often adults had spoken for him, around him, over him. Trainers, promoters, commentators, all narrating his meaning while he enacted it. His body had been the argument, his voice an afterthought. Now the balance reversed. He spoke about childhood not as prologue but as foundation, about Brownsville not as origin myth but as lived reality, where vulnerability carried cost, where reputation substituted for safety, where emotional expression was a liability. These descriptions did not seek sympathy, they sought accuracy. Accuracy changes the emotional temperature of memory. It cools extremes without erasing them. Tyson also began acknowledging the allure of chaos. Order, he realized, had always felt imposed. Chaos felt familiar. It mirrored early life. It offered a strange comfort through predictability of threat. This insight reframed self-sabotage. It was not always destruction. Sometimes it was return. Return to what was known, even if harmful. Such patterns, once named, did not disappear. But naming altered the relationship to them. Awareness introduced friction. Friction slowed momentum. Slowing momentum created space. In this space, Tyson experimented with routines unconnected to dominance. Gardening, reading, caring for animals. Activities without spectators. Tasks that did not demand triumph. These were not symbolic gestures. They were grounding practices. Grounding, he discovered, did not mean escape from intensity. It meant channeling it. Energy once spent on proving strength could be redirected toward sustaining life, however modestly. This redirection challenged a core belief that value comes from impact. Impact, in the ring, was immediate and measurable. Outside it, impact became diffuse, delayed, sometimes invisible. This invisibility tested patience. Patience had never been his strength. Yet patience, unlike aggression, accumulates quietly. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself over time, in reduced reactivity, in softened responses, in the ability to remain present during discomfort. These shifts were incremental. Some days regressed, others surprised him. He began to understand why so many narratives prefer peaks over plateaus. Plateaus are ambiguous, they resist applause. But they are where integration happens. Integration requires confronting contradictions without resolving them prematurely. Tyson confronted the contradiction of being both victim and perpetrator, of having been exploited and having caused harm, of having suffered neglect and having inflicted pain. Holding these truths simultaneously did not produce peace. It produced honesty. Honesty became a guiding principle, not confession for spectacle, but candor for coherence. He corrected stories when they drifted toward myth. He acknowledged uncertainty when memory failed. Memory, he learned, is not archive, it is reconstruction. As his reconstructions evolved, so did his sense of responsibility. Responsibility expanded beyond legal or moral categories. It became relational. How does one live in a way that reduces harm now, regardless of what cannot be undone? This question reframed accountability. It shifted focus from punishment to practice. Practice, unlike judgment, is ongoing. Tyson practiced listening, not as performance but as discipline. He resisted the impulse to dominate conversation. He allowed silence to do work. Silence, once threatening, became instructive. In silence, unresolved grief surfaced, not only grief for others, but for himself, for the child who had been hardened before being held, for the adult who had been used before being understood. This grief did not seek resolution, it sought recognition. Recognition softened self-contempt, which had long fueled destructive cycles. Without self-contempt, anger lost some urgency. It no longer needed to defend a wounded core constantly under threat. This did not eliminate anger, it contextualized it. Context transforms reaction into information. Tyson began to view emotions less as commands and more as signals. Signals require interpretation. Interpretation requires patience. Patience, slowly practiced, altered self-talk. Internal monologues, once dominated by condemnation, shifted toward inquiry. "Why now?" replaced "What's wrong with me?" This shift mattered because inquiry opens options. As his internal landscape changed, so did his interactions. Relationships stabilized slightly. Trust rebuilt cautiously. Boundaries clarified. Boundaries had once been external, enforced through intimidation. Now they became internal, articulated through choice. Choice emerged where reflex once ruled. These developments did not make headlines. They did not rewrite public memory overnight. But they reshaped lived experience. Tyson's story in this phase resisted spectacle. It moved at human scale. At this scale, the question of meaning resurfaced differently. Meaning was no longer sought through dominance or recognition. It emerged through alignment, between values and behavior, between awareness and action. Alignment is fragile. It requires maintenance. Tyson accepted this fragility. He no longer chased permanence. He worked toward consistency. Consistency, unlike perfection, tolerates failure. Failure, when integrated, becomes instruction. This approach to life contrasted sharply with earlier models of success. There was no championship belt for patience, no trophy for restraint. Yet the absence of reward did not negate the value. Value, he learned, does not always announce itself. As years passed, the urgency to define himself faded. Definitions, once essential for survival, became optional. He allowed himself to be unfinished. This allowance created room for curiosity. Curiosity about others, about ideas, about histories beyond his own. Curiosity, unlike certainty, invites humility. Humility reoriented the story once more. No longer about rise or fall, dominance or disgrace, the narrative began to resemble something quieter, a prolonged effort to live with awareness in the aftermath of intensity. This effort continues. It does not resolve the past. It does not redeem it fully. But it offers something else, a way forward that acknowledges complexity without being paralyzed by it. As this chapter closes, the focus shifts again, from internal reconstruction toward external responsibility, from understanding oneself toward understanding one's place in a larger fabric of consequence and care. That transition, subtle and demanding, carries its own questions, and those questions wait, patient and unresolved, for what comes next. When a life becomes public property, responsibility begins to shift in strange ways. Stories harden. Roles are assigned. Complexity is compressed into labels that travel faster than truth ever could. For Tyson, this compression had already happened long ago. Now, living inside its echo, he began to sense a deeper tension, not between innocence and guilt, but between narration and reality. The world had decided who he was. That decision lingered everywhere, in interviews framed as redemption or downfall, in questions that assumed conclusions before answers formed, in the quiet expectation that he should either defend himself endlessly or disappear politely. Neither option felt honest. What remained unsettled was not simply reputation, but authorship. Who gets to tell a life once it has been lived loudly? Who controls meaning after the noise fades? These questions are not unique to Tyson. They shadow anyone whose identity has been shaped under scrutiny. But in his case, the intensity magnified them. He noticed how easily people spoke about him in the past tense, even while he sat across from them, as if the version that mattered had already concluded, as if the present was merely epilogue. This dissonance sharpened awareness. Awareness, once sharpened, changes how one listens. Tyson began hearing patterns in how stories about him were constructed. The same moments repeated, the same symbols invoked, violence foregrounded, context blurred, silence filled the spaces where nuance belonged. He did not interrupt these narratives aggressively. He observed them. Observation revealed something unsettling. The stories told about him served needs beyond accuracy. They reassured audiences about morality, about consequences, about distance between us and him. Simplified narratives protect listeners from discomfort. Discomfort arises when contradictions are allowed to coexist. Tyson's existence unsettled clean moral arcs. He had been both a product of neglect and an agent of harm, both exploited and destructive, both disciplined and chaotic. Such duality resists easy consumption, so it was flattened. Flattening is efficient. It is also violent in its own quiet way. Recognizing this did not inspire bitterness. It inspired caution. He became careful about what he shared, not from secrecy, but from respect for complexity. Some truths, he realized, lose integrity when reduced to sound bites. This realization reshaped his relationship to confession. Confession, when performed publicly, can become another spectacle. It can satisfy curiosity without fostering understanding. He chose restraint instead. Restraint does not erase accountability. It changes its audience. Tyson focused increasingly on private accountability, on how he treated those near him, on how he responded when triggered, on how he repaired harm when possible. Repair is less visible than apology. It unfolds slowly, through consistency rather than declaration. Consistency demanded boundaries. Boundaries with media, boundaries with admirers who projected fantasies, boundaries with critics who sought provocation. Setting these boundaries was uncomfortable. He had once survived by yielding to stronger forces or overpowering them. Negotiation was new terrain. Negotiation requires trust in one's own judgment. That trust had been eroded early. Rebuilding it meant revisiting moments when intuition had been overridden by fear, by authority, by the promise of belonging. He examined how often compliance had masqueraded as choice. This examination did not indict others exclusively. It illuminated a system. Systems reward certain behaviors and punish others. Tyson had thrived within a system that valued spectacle over sustainability, output over integration. When he deviated from that system, consequences arrived swiftly. Support withdrew. Judgment intensified. This pattern echoed broader cultural dynamics. Society celebrates intensity until it becomes inconvenient. Then it demands containment. Tyson's story, seen this way, became less anomalous. It reflected a recurring cycle: creation, consumption, rejection. Recognizing this cycle reframed shame. Shame, he realized, thrives in isolation. It convinces individuals that systemic outcomes are personal failures. Context weakens shame's grip. Context does not absolve, it clarifies. With clarification came a quieter anger. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that questions structure. Why are certain lives amplified without adequate care? Why are some mistakes immortalized while others are forgiven quietly? These questions did not demand immediate answers. They invited reflection. Reflection, when extended beyond the self, becomes critique. Tyson's critique was not academic. It was embodied. He had lived inside the consequences. He noticed how narratives of redemption often required performance, tears on cue, specific phrases, aesthetic humility. Deviation from this script invited suspicion. But healing does not follow scripts. Sometimes it is uneven, sometimes it is silent, sometimes it contradicts expectation. Tyson refused to perform healing for validation. He accepted that this refusal might disappoint. Disappointment, he learned, is survivable. Survivability shifted priorities. What mattered increasingly was not how he was perceived, but how he participated in the present. Participation grounded him in tangible interactions rather than abstract reputations. He spent time with people who did not require explanation, who knew him outside the frame, who responded to tone rather than headlines. These relationships offered feedback unmediated by projection. Feedback, when trusted, accelerates growth. He also engaged cautiously with public dialogue, not to correct every misconception, but to insert complexity where possible. He spoke about fear without romanticizing it, about power without glorifying it, about damage without theatrical remorse. This approach confused some audiences. Confusion is not failure. Confusion can signal engagement with something unresolved. As Tyson's relationship to his own story evolved, so did his understanding of legacy. Legacy, he realized, is not what one leaves behind intentionally. It is what remains after intentions are forgotten. This realization softened the urge to control perception. Control, once essential for survival, had become a burden. Letting go of it was gradual. He allowed contradictions to stand without resolution, allowed discomfort to remain, allowed silence to replace defense. Silence, when chosen, can be dignified. In that silence he sensed a shift. The past no longer demanded constant rehearsal. It receded slightly, making room for presence. Presence did not erase memory, it reorganized it. Memory became reference rather than residence. From this vantage point, Tyson could look at his earlier life without being consumed by it. He could acknowledge harm without collapsing into self-loathing. He could recognize survival without glorifying damage. This balance was unstable but workable. Workable is enough. As the world continued to interpret his life through familiar frames, he continued to live beyond them. This divergence created tension. But tension, unlike chaos, can be held. Held tension becomes strength of a quieter kind. The story now moved forward not through spectacle, but through sustained attention to how one lives after intensity, after domination, after collapse. That forward movement does not announce itself loudly. It unfolds quietly, asking different questions. Questions about responsibility without performance, about meaning without applause, about whether a life, once defined by excess, can find coherence in restraint. Those questions do not demand immediate answers. They remain open, and in that openness the next chapter waits. There is a kind of silence that does not soothe. It does not calm the breath or soften the edges of thought. It presses inward, reshaping time itself. When Tyson entered prison, this was the silence that greeted him. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but dense, repetitive, and slow. Days lost their shape. Without the rhythms that had once defined him, training schedules, media appearances, the constant external demand, time stretched unevenly. Mornings arrived without anticipation, nights closed without release. The body remained strong, but strength no longer had an obvious purpose. This disorientation was not immediate. At first, habit attempted to survive. He woke early. He exercised. He tried to impose structure where none was required. But structure, when unsupported by meaning, becomes hollow. Gradually, resistance softened. Softening did not mean surrender. It meant adjustment. Prison removes spectacle. No one is impressed by reputation. No one fears legacy. Inside, stories circulate, but they do not carry the same weight. Everyone has a past. Everyone has a version of themselves they would rather not revisit. In this environment, Tyson was not unique. He was simply present. Presence forced a confrontation with aspects of himself long deferred. Without crowds to absorb attention, thought turned inward. Not toward grand reflection at first, but toward small irritations, regrets, flashes of memory that surfaced uninvited. Memory behaves differently when there is nowhere to escape. He recalled moments not often discussed publicly, quiet choices, subtle warnings ignored, times when something inside had urged pause and been overridden by momentum. These recollections did not arrive as accusations. They arrived as observations. Observation, unaccompanied by judgment, creates space. In that space, reading entered his life differently, not as performance or study, but as companionship. Books offered voices that did not demand response, philosophical texts, spiritual reflections, and autobiographical fragments from others who had fallen and recalibrated. He noticed patterns. Many writers spoke of power as a distortion of self-perception, of how intensity narrows vision, of how fear, when harnessed improperly, consumes what it was meant to protect. These ideas resonated quietly. Fear had always been present in Tyson's life, but it had rarely been examined gently. It had been weaponized, disciplined, exploited. Now, without an opponent to project it onto, fear revealed subtler forms. Fear of irrelevance, fear of stillness, fear of existing without a defined role. Prison stripped away role. Without role, identity loosened. This loosening was uncomfortable but necessary. He began to see how tightly he had clung to external validation, even when it harmed him. Applause had substituted for grounding. Authority had substituted for trust. Trust, he realized, cannot be outsourced indefinitely. Incarceration forced responsibility inward. Not legal responsibility, that had already been determined, but existential responsibility. How does one live with oneself when performance ends? This question did not demand immediate resolution. It lingered. Routine eventually re-emerged, but altered. Exercise became meditative rather than preparatory. Conversations, limited though they were, grew more honest. There was less to prove. He listened more than he spoke. Listening revealed common threads among men whose lives had unraveled differently but converged in the same place. Childhood instability, unexamined anger, systems that rewarded aggression without teaching integration. This did not absolve anyone. It contextualized. Context widened empathy. Empathy, when allowed, complicates simplistic moral narratives. Tyson did not romanticize this environment. It was restrictive, often dehumanizing. But within constraint, something unexpected surfaced. A pause long enough to disrupt momentum. Momentum, once broken, reveals choices previously hidden. He noticed how often his earlier life had been dictated by urgency. Decisions made quickly, reinforced by reward, rarely revisited. Prison slowed this cycle. Slowness altered perception. Thoughts stretched. Emotions surfaced without immediate outlets. There were days of heaviness, days of restlessness, days of numbness. Numbness, too, carried information. It signaled exhaustion. Exhaustion not just of body but of identity maintenance. Maintaining an image requires energy. Without it, something simpler emerged. A man learning to sit with discomfort without reacting. This was unfamiliar territory. Reaction had once been survival. Now reaction created consequences. Learning to pause before responding became a form of discipline different from any he had known. Not imposed externally, but cultivated internally. Internal discipline is quieter. It lacks ceremony. It requires repetition without applause. In this space, spirituality took on a less performative role. Not as doctrine, not as promise, but as inquiry. Questions about purpose, forgiveness, and humility surfaced, not as conclusions, but as considerations. He did not seek to redefine himself grandly. He sought to understand what remained when definitions fell away. What remained was incomplete, uncertain, but present. Presence softened the past's grip, not erased, reframed. He began to see his life not as a sequence of rises and falls, but as a pattern of acceleration and collapse. Each acceleration unexamined, each collapse forcing reckoning. Perhaps collapse, he wondered, was the only force strong enough to interrupt velocity. This was not justification, it was observation. Observation reduces illusion. Illusion thrives on distance from consequence. Prison eliminated that distance. Every choice, no matter how small, carried immediate effect. How he spoke, how he moved, how he responded to provocation. Provocation did not disappear, but the stakes had shifted. There was no advantage to dominance here. No reward for intimidation. Cooperation mattered more. This environment, paradoxically, demanded restraint over force. Restraint, once learned, changes self-perception. He began to recognize moments when restraint had been possible earlier but felt inaccessible. He saw how certain paths had narrowed choices until collapse became inevitable. Inevitability, he realized, is often constructed gradually. Understanding this did not rewrite the past. It altered the future. As time passed, the outside world receded slightly. Headlines faded. Noise softened. The internal dialogue grew clearer. Clearer did not mean kinder. It meant more honest. Honesty, sustained, reorganizes values. What mattered now was not reclaiming what had been lost, but determining what could be carried forward without repetition of harm. This question remained unresolved as his sentence continued. Resolution was not required yet. Only attention, only patience, only the willingness to remain present without knowing who one would be when the door eventually opened. That door, still distant, waited, and with it, another confrontation, not with confinement, but with freedom. Freedom after stillness is not simple. It requires recalibration. That recalibration would come next. Freedom does not arrive as relief alone. It carries weight. When the door finally opened and Tyson stepped back into the world, the air felt familiar yet altered, as if time itself had shifted texture while he understood it differently. The noise returned first, voices, expectations, the hum of attention, but his relationship to it had changed. The world remembered him vividly. It always had. But he returned carrying a quieter memory of himself, shaped not by spectacle, but by stillness. These two versions did not immediately reconcile. Outside, time moved quickly again. Schedules filled. Decisions demanded speed. People spoke as if continuity had never been broken, as if the interruption had been merely a pause rather than a fracture. But fractures alter structure. His body responded before his thoughts did. Training resumed, but without the same urgency. Movement felt heavier, not from age alone, but from awareness. Each routine carried echoes of earlier discipline, yet something essential had shifted. The rhythm was slower, the purpose less singular. Return narratives are seductive. They promise restoration. They imply that what was lost can be reclaimed intact. But restoration is rarely possible without erasure, and erasure demands forgetting. Tyson did not forget. He noticed how quickly others wanted him to resume familiar roles: the formidable fighter, the fallen icon, the cautionary tale. These archetypes offered comfort to observers. They required little adjustment. But living inside them felt restrictive. Expectation is a subtle form of pressure. It suggests that deviation is failure, that growth must remain legible to external standards. He felt this pressure in interviews framed as comeback stories, in training camps designed to replicate former intensity, in comparisons that ignored context and transformation. Transformation, when genuine, disrupts comparison. The body he trained now carried history differently. Injuries healed imperfectly. Reflexes remained, but recovery demanded patience. He learned to listen to fatigue rather than override it. Listening was new. In the past, ignoring limits had been framed as strength. Now it revealed fragility. This fragility was not weakness. It was information. Information, when respected, prevents repetition. The ring awaited him, unchanged in appearance. Ropes taut, canvas familiar, lights bright, but stepping into it felt different. The space no longer promised transcendence. It offered confrontation. Confrontation not only with opponents but with memory. Each movement summoned echoes of former dominance and former collapse. The crowd's energy surged, but he perceived it with distance, as though observing from within rather than being consumed by it. This distance was protective. Protection, once external, had become internal. Fights unfolded. Victories arrived. Losses followed. The pattern lacked the inevitability of earlier years. Outcomes no longer defined him entirely. This detachment unsettled some observers. They expected rage, ferocity, reclamation. Instead, they encountered restraint. Restraint is often misread as hesitation, but hesitation can signal consideration. Tyson considered more now. Considered consequence. Considered longevity. Considered whether proving anything was still necessary. The question lingered: what does one fight for after fighting has cost so much? There was no immediate answer. Outside the ring, life demanded navigation of relationships reshaped by absence and change. Some connections resumed seamlessly. Others strained under unresolved tension. Distance revealed which bonds had been sustained by proximity alone and which carried depth. Depth tolerates change. Surface fractures. He observed this without bitterness. People evolve at different speeds. Shared history does not guarantee shared future. Acceptance emerged slowly. With acceptance came a reframing of ambition. The desire to dominate gave way to the desire to understand. Understanding required humility. Humility was not natural to a world built on hierarchy. It had to be practiced deliberately. He practiced by listening more than asserting, by acknowledging uncertainty, by resisting the urge to perform certainty where none existed. Public response varied. Some admired the shift, others dismissed it. Interpretation remained beyond his control. Control, once central to survival, now felt optional. Letting go of control introduced vulnerability. Vulnerability invited criticism. Criticism, once triggering, became manageable. This progression was not linear. There were moments of regression, bursts of anger, impatience with perceived disrespect, temptation to revert to familiar defenses. But recovery from these moments was quicker. Speed of recovery matters more than absence of error. He recognized this in himself. He also recognized it as a broader human pattern. The idea of redemption, often demanded by audiences, began to feel insufficient. Redemption implies a return to purity. But purity is a fiction. Lives accumulate residue. Perhaps repair was more accurate. Repair does not erase damage. It stabilizes structure. Stabilization requires ongoing effort. Tyson engaged in this effort quietly. Through mentorship, through reflection, through acknowledging harm without dramatization. He spoke occasionally about fear, not as a tool but as a condition. About how fear, unexamined, seeks expression through dominance. About how understanding fear reduces its need to perform. These insights did not transform public narratives overnight. Narratives resist complexity, but they altered his internal landscape. The internal landscape determines sustainability. As years progressed, the urgency to remain central faded. Peripheral existence felt tolerable, even preferable. There was less demand to be seen constantly. Visibility had once equaled survival. Now it equaled exposure. Choosing when to appear became an act of self-preservation. He recognized that presence does not require constant display. Influence does not require dominance. This recognition extended beyond boxing. He explored other forms of expression, speaking, reflecting, engaging in dialogue rather than contest. These spaces lacked the clarity of competition but offered depth. Depth does not resolve quickly. It accumulates. Accumulation of insight altered how he perceived his earlier self, not with contempt, not with nostalgia, but with contextual compassion. Compassion for a boy shaped by neglect, for a young man shaped by intensity, for an adult learning restraint late. This compassion did not absolve, it integrated. Integration allowed coherence. Coherence reduced fragmentation. Fragmentation had once fueled volatility. Now coherence supported steadiness. Steadiness did not eliminate struggle. It changed its texture. The struggle became quieter, internal, less performative. And in that quiet, a different kind of strength took root. Strength that does not seek to overwhelm. Strength that holds contradiction without collapse. Strength that remains present without demanding resolution. This strength did not conclude the story. It prepared the ground for what followed. There are moments in a public life that refuse to settle quietly into the past. They remain suspended, replayed endlessly, reduced to symbols that overshadow everything before and after. For Tyson, one such moment lingered like a held breath, an instant that froze complexity into shock, an act that became shorthand for an entire life. What is rarely examined is the silence that follows such moments. After the noise fades, after judgment hardens, there is a vacuum where understanding might have been. Into that vacuum, speculation rushes. Motives are simplified. Context collapses. The human being recedes behind the event. Tyson lived inside that aftermath. He did not rush to explain it away. Explanation offered little comfort. Words, when spoken too quickly, become defenses rather than reflections. Instead, he sat with the consequences as they unfolded: legal, professional, personal. Consequences are clarifying. They strip away fantasy. The public often imagines controversy as chaos erupting without warning. But for those inside it, such moments are rarely sudden. They are culminations, pressures accumulated, signals ignored, internal tensions unresolved. Tyson began to recognize this pattern with uncomfortable clarity. He traced the path backward, not to excuse but to understand. The erosion of structure, the reemergence of unchecked impulse, the illusion that intensity could still substitute for balance. Balance had been fragile for some time. Without the anchoring presence of discipline rooted in care rather than control, volatility resurfaced. Old instincts, once tempered, returned under stress. Stress narrows vision. In narrowed vision, options appear binary: attack or collapse, assert or disappear. This is not unique to Tyson. It is a human response under threat, perceived or real. But perception matters as much as reality. In high-stakes environments, perception amplifies pressure. The sense of being cornered, judged, or humiliated can trigger primitive responses. The body reacts before reflection intervenes. Tyson understood this not as theory but as lived experience. Understanding did not bring peace immediately. It brought responsibility. Responsibility to acknowledge harm without dramatization. Responsibility to accept consequences without self-destruction. Responsibility to interrogate the internal conditions that allowed such a moment to occur. This interrogation was not public. It unfolded privately, slowly, unevenly. He noticed how often the world demanded either condemnation or justification, leaving little room for examination. Examination requires patience. It resists spectacle. Spectacle demands resolution. But some events do not resolve neatly. They fracture narratives permanently. Tyson learned to live with that fracture. Living with fracture requires integration rather than repair. Repair implies restoration. Integration accepts alteration. His public image had been altered irrevocably. The question became whether his internal life would remain hostage to that alteration. He chose not to let it. This choice did not erase regret. Regret remained quiet and persistent. But regret, when acknowledged, can coexist with forward movement. Forward movement does not require forgetting. It requires orientation. Tyson oriented himself toward understanding patterns of impulse. He studied how quickly adrenaline bypasses reflection, how environments designed for confrontation reward escalation, how fame distorts feedback, amplifying validation and muting correction. These insights extended beyond boxing. They applied to relationships, to communication, to self-regulation. He recognized how easily systems mistake intensity for authenticity, how aggression masquerades as honesty, how dominance substitutes for clarity. Clarity, he learned, is calm. Calm had once felt inaccessible. Now it became essential. Cultivating calm required deliberate practice, breath awareness, pausing before response, accepting silence where reaction once filled space. These practices did not transform him into a different person. They revealed aspects long overshadowed. He became aware of how much of his earlier life had been lived in reaction to fear, to authority, to expectation. Reaction creates momentum, but not direction. Direction requires intention. Intention must be renewed continually. The world continued to revisit the controversial moment, often without curiosity. It became a fixture in retrospectives, a predictable pivot point. Tyson did not resist its recurrence. Resistance would have anchored him to it. Instead, he reframed his relationship to it internally. The moment became a marker rather than a definition, a boundary that clarified what could no longer continue. Boundaries are instructive. They delineate capacity. Exceeding capacity invites collapse. Understanding capacity fosters sustainability. This understanding softened his relationship with power. Power, once intoxicating, now appeared precarious. It magnified flaws as much as strengths. Unchecked power isolates. Isolation distorts perception. Distorted perception increases risk. These realizations did not absolve harm. They contextualized it. Context allows learning. Learning alters trajectory. Tyson's trajectory shifted toward caution rather than conquest, toward presence rather than performance. This shift confused some observers. They expected either defiance or repentance performed loudly. They encountered instead a quieter recalibration. Recalibration lacks drama. It unfolds gradually, often invisibly. He engaged in conversations about accountability that avoided theatrics. He acknowledged wrongdoing without seeking sympathy. He resisted narratives that framed him solely as villain or victim. Resistance to simplification became a guiding principle. Simplification erases humanity. Humanity thrives in contradiction. He accepted that some audiences would never revise their understanding. Acceptance does not require agreement. Agreement is optional. Self-coherence is not. As time passed, the emotional charge surrounding the incident dulled slightly, not because it was forgotten, but because it was integrated into a broader narrative of change. Change does not negate memory. It alters emphasis. The incident remained part of his story, but no longer its axis. He began to see how fixation on singular moments obscures gradual processes, how lives are shaped more by daily choices than by isolated events. This perspective fostered patience. Patience is an undervalued strength. It resists urgency. It invites depth. Depth supports transformation that endures. Tyson's transformation did not announce itself with declarations. It manifested in restraint, in measured speech, in willingness to sit with discomfort. Discomfort became a teacher rather than a threat. This reorientation did not resolve all tension. Public memory is slow to adapt, but internal alignment matters more. Alignment reduces internal conflict. Reduced conflict frees attention. Freed attention allows presence. Presence, sustained, becomes the ground from which the next phase emerges. That phase would ask different questions about decline, about letting go, about redefining worth beyond performance, questions that could not be rushed, questions that required the quiet patience now cultivated. They waited ahead, unhurried. Every life shaped by intensity eventually encounters a slowing, not a dramatic halt, but a gradual thinning of momentum. For Tyson, this slowing arrived not as defeat alone, but as accumulation of years, of injuries, of experiences that no longer fit neatly into the rhythm of competition. The body began speaking more insistently. Pain, once ignored, now lingered. Recovery took longer. Movements that had once felt automatic required attention. This was not simply aging, it was reckoning. A body used as an instrument of force was asking to be treated as something else. Listening to the body demanded humility. Humility had not been the currency of earlier success. Now it became necessary. Without it, frustration grew. With it, adaptation became possible. The ring, once a place of certainty, grew ambiguous. Outcomes no longer followed expectation. Victory did not guarantee satisfaction. Loss did not always sting as sharply, but it carried weight. Weight invites reflection. Reflection led Tyson to consider what had sustained him beyond competition. The answer was not obvious. Fighting had structured identity, routine, and purpose for so long that imagining life beyond it felt disorienting. Disorientation is a threshold. It signals the end of one orientation and the absence of another. This absence can be frightening. It can also be fertile. Tyson approached it cautiously. He experimented with roles, entrepreneur, speaker, commentator, but none offered immediate coherence. Each felt partial, provisional. Partial identities frustrate those accustomed to total immersion, but they also prevent collapse. He began to accept that the next phase would not replicate the clarity of the previous one. It would require tolerance for ambiguity. Ambiguity does not reward quickly. It demands patience without guarantee. Financial instability intensified this uncertainty. Wealth, once abundant, proved ephemeral. Decisions made under pressure resurfaced as consequences delayed. Money, when plentiful, obscures fragility. When scarce, it exposes habits. Exposure invites reassessment. Tyson confronted how easily success had insulated him from feedback. Advisors had come and gone. Warnings had been muffled by momentum. Now the absence of buffer sharpened awareness. Awareness can feel unforgiving, but it also clarifies responsibility. He recognized patterns of trust misplaced, of delegation without oversight, of impulse over deliberation. These patterns were not unique to finances, they echoed across life. Seeing them without self-contempt required discipline. Self-contempt paralyzes. Discipline mobilizes. He sought education not as credential, but as grounding. Learning about contracts, about business structures, about the mechanics behind decisions once outsourced. This learning was humbling. Humility, sustained, reduces defensiveness. Reduced defensiveness invites growth. As the public narrative increasingly framed his career as decline, Tyson felt less compelled to resist. Decline, he realized, was a word shaped by external metrics. It measured distance from peak performance, not distance from coherence. Coherence mattered more now. Coherence asked different questions. How does one live when applause fades? How does one define value without comparison? How does one remain present when attention shifts elsewhere? These questions do not demand spectacle, they demand honesty. Honesty led him to acknowledge grief. Grief for the clarity of earlier purpose. Grief for relationships strained or lost. Grief for opportunities mishandled. Grief, when allowed, softens rigidity. Softened rigidity permits reorientation. Reorientation unfolded slowly, through smaller routines, through attention to health beyond performance, through relationships chosen for steadiness rather than intensity. He spent time in quieter settings. Nature offered feedback without judgment. Walking without destination recalibrated attention. Silence regained value. Silence does not erase identity. It reveals what remains without reinforcement. What remained was curiosity. Curiosity about inner patterns, about how fear operates beneath bravado, about how control substitutes for trust. This curiosity extended toward others. He listened to stories without urgency to respond. He noticed how many people navigated similar transitions, athletes, artists, professionals whose peak years had defined them. Their shared experience offered perspective. Perspective normalizes transition. Normalization reduces shame. Shame, diminished, releases energy for creation. Creation took different forms now. Not competition, but contribution. Sharing insight where appropriate. Mentoring selectively. Engaging in dialogue rather than debate. Dialogue requires openness. Openness risks misunderstanding. He accepted that risk. Public perception continued to oscillate. Some celebrated vulnerability. Others dismissed it as narrative reinvention. Tyson did not chase consensus. Consensus is unstable. Self-alignment is steadier. Alignment demanded consistency between values and action. Not perfection, but effort. Effort, sustained, builds integrity. Integrity is quiet. It does not announce itself. As the years progressed, the sense of urgency that once propelled him diminished. Time no longer felt like an opponent. It felt like a companion, sometimes challenging, often instructive. Instruction arrived through setbacks as much as successes, through moments of doubt that prompted recalibration rather than panic. This recalibration extended to how he viewed his own legacy. Legacy, once imagined as dominance etched into record books, now appeared more diffuse. It lived in conversations, in influence, in the way others interpreted resilience and restraint. Restraint had become a central theme, not imposed, but chosen. Choosing restraint over reaction signaled growth. Growth does not erase the past. It changes its function. The past became reference, not residence. From this vantage, Tyson could see his life as a series of adaptations rather than a rise and fall. Adaptations to environment, to expectation, to internal states. Some adaptations had been maladaptive. Others preserved survival. Understanding this complexity reduced the urge to simplify. Simplification is tempting in moments of uncertainty. But simplification obscures learning. Learning thrives in nuance. Nuance invites patience. Patience supports endurance. Endurance, redefined, meant sustaining presence without spectacle. Continuing engagement without domination. Accepting fluctuation without collapse. This endurance did not guarantee comfort. It offered stability. Stability allowed him to face the next phase, one less about proving worth and more about integrating experience. Integration is subtle. It requires time. Time now felt less adversarial. It moved alongside him, opening space for the final recalibrations yet to come. Those recalibrations would ask deeper questions about meaning beyond achievement, about reconciliation with self, about what remains when competition ends. They waited quietly ahead. There comes a stage in many lives when movement slows enough for patterns to become visible. Not the sharp patterns of ambition or fear, but broader shapes formed over decades. For Tyson, this stage did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived gradually, through repetition, through the steady wearing down of urgency. Urgency had once been his compass. Without it, direction felt unfamiliar. Yet unfamiliar does not mean empty. In this quieter phase, he began to notice how often his earlier life had been defined by reaction. Reaction to threat. Reaction to expectation. Reaction to opportunity arriving faster than understanding. Now, without the constant demand to respond, there was room to choose. Choice, when it replaces reaction, alters responsibility. He became more intentional about how he spent time, not chasing relevance, but cultivating steadiness. Some days were unremarkable. Others carried insight without drama. The absence of spectacle allowed small realizations to surface. Small realizations accumulate. He reflected often on fear, not the fear he had once used as fuel, but the fear beneath it. The fear of being unseen, of being abandoned, of being insignificant without performance. These fears, once masked by intensity, became clearer in stillness. Clarity did not eliminate them. It contextualized them. Context transforms fear from command into signal. Listening to that signal changed how he engaged with the world. He spoke more openly about vulnerability, not as confession, but as acknowledgement. Vulnerability ceased to feel like exposure. It felt like accuracy. Accuracy fosters trust. Trust reshaped relationships. Those built on projection faded naturally. Those grounded in mutual presence deepened. He accepted that not everyone could accompany him into this phase. Acceptance reduced friction. Friction, once constant, had drained energy. With energy reclaimed, he explored forms of expression that did not depend on domination. Conversation replaced confrontation. Reflection replaced assertion. Humor softened edges once sharpened by defensiveness. Humor understated became a bridge. He laughed at his own rigidity, at the seriousness that had once felt necessary for survival. Laughter loosened what discipline alone could not. This did not trivialize the past, it reframed it. Reframing allowed compassion to extend inward. Compassion for the child shaped by neglect, for the young man shaped by expectation, for the adult learning restraint late. This inward compassion altered how he viewed others. Judgment softened. Curiosity expanded. He listened longer, interrupted less. Listening revealed how many people carry unexamined narratives imposed early and reinforced relentlessly. He recognized this pattern from his own life. Recognition builds empathy. Empathy changes ethics. Ethics, once abstract or performative, became practical. How to speak without harming. How to disagree without humiliating. How to hold power responsibly, even in small interactions. Small interactions matter. They accumulate into character. Character, he realized, is not fixed. It is shaped continually by choice. This understanding diminished regret's dominance. Regret remained, but it no longer defined identity. It informed it. Informing rather than defining is crucial. Defined identities resist change. Informed identities adapt. Adaptation had always been his strength, even when misdirected. Now it found steadier application. He engaged with spiritual ideas less as doctrine and more as practice. Presence, attention, acceptance of impermanence. These concepts resonated not as ideals, but as descriptions of lived experience. Impermanence was no longer threatening. It felt accurate. Accuracy reduces anxiety. He accepted that public perception would always lag behind personal evolution, that some would remember only fragments, that others would reinterpret selectively. This no longer felt like injustice. It felt inevitable. Inevitability invites release. Release does not mean indifference. It means relinquishing the need to correct every misunderstanding. Energy once spent on defense redirected toward maintenance, of health, of relationships, of internal balance. Balance, once elusive, became a guiding value. Balance is dynamic. It requires adjustment. He adjusted by honoring limits. Physical limits acknowledged early. Emotional limits respected. Social limits clarified. Limits embraced prevent collapse. This philosophy extended to ambition. Ambition did not vanish. It transformed. From conquering arenas to sustaining well-being, from accumulating accolades to cultivating coherence. Coherence feels different from success. Success is external. Coherence is internal. Internal coherence does not demand validation. It sustains itself. As Tyson settled into this mode, he noticed a subtle shift in how time felt. The past no longer loomed as a constant presence. The future no longer demanded urgency. The present expanded. Expansion of the present allows attention to deepen. Deep attention reveals meaning without forcing it. Meaning emerged through participation in ordinary moments, shared meals, unstructured conversations, quiet mornings without agenda. These moments lacked narrative grandeur. They carried weight nonetheless. Weight Once measured in force, now measured in presence. Presence anchored him. Anchoring reduced volatility. Volatility had once defined him. Its absence felt unfamiliar, then welcome. He acknowledged that some would interpret this calm as decline, as loss of edge. He accepted that interpretation without internalizing it. Internalization is optional. Choice returned again and again. Choosing not to react, choosing not to perform, choosing not to dominate. These choices accumulated into a different legacy, one less visible but more sustainable. Sustainability, he realized, had been absent from earlier phases. Intensity without sustainability collapses eventually. This collapse had taught him. Teaching does not require preaching. He shared insights selectively, aware that wisdom offered prematurely becomes noise. Silence chosen became an ally. In silence he sensed a closing of certain loops. Not all, some remain open indefinitely. But enough had settled to allow a sense of continuity, a life not split into incompatible chapters, but connected through understanding. Understanding does not resolve all pain, it integrates it. Integration reduces fragmentation. Fragmentation had once fueled extremes. Now integration supported steadiness. Steadiness prepared him for the final reframing still ahead. The question of legacy beyond self, of what remains when personal narrative dissolves into collective memory. That question did not demand immediate articulation. It rested quietly, waiting for the last reflection. Every story that stretches across decades eventually reaches a quieter place where movement no longer seeks destination and reflection replaces momentum. This is not an ending in the dramatic sense. It is a settling, a moment when the shape of a life becomes visible not through highlights or failures, but through continuity. For Tyson, this continuity emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the need to define himself receded. The world still spoke his name with expectation, curiosity, judgment. But those sounds no longer determined his inner rhythm. They passed through rather than landing. What remained was presence. Presence does not announce itself. It does not compete for attention. It exists fully in the moment, attentive to what is happening rather than what is remembered or anticipated. In this presence, Tyson could finally observe his life as a whole, rather than as a sequence of crises and recoveries. Patterns became clearer, not just the visible ones, violence, fame, collapse, but the quieter threads beneath them. The longing for safety, the search for belonging, the confusion between control and care. These threads had woven through everything. Understanding this softened the urge to separate the past into compartments of pride and shame. Pride and shame, he realized, are both distortions when held too tightly. One inflates, the other constricts. Neither allows full view. A fuller view required acceptance. Acceptance does not excuse harm. It acknowledges reality without resistance. Reality included the damage done to others and to himself. It included opportunities squandered and lessons learned late. It included moments of extraordinary focus and moments of complete disintegration. All of it belonged. Belonging, when extended inward, changes how one relates to memory. Memory becomes less accusatory, less nostalgic. It becomes informative. Information can be used wisely. Wisdom, in this context, was not a set of conclusions but a posture, a way of standing in uncertainty without rushing to resolve it, a willingness to admit that some questions never close. Questions like what it means to be powerful. Power, once equated with domination, now appeared as responsibility. Responsibility for one's impact. Responsibility for restraint. Responsibility for acknowledging limits. Limits had once felt like enemies. Now they felt like guides. Guides prevent excess. Excess had nearly consumed him. This recognition altered how he viewed younger versions of himself, not with contempt, but with a sober compassion. That young boy, shaped by neglect and fear, had done what he could with what he had. The structures around him had rewarded intensity without teaching integration. Integration, he learned, must be taught or discovered painfully. Pain had been his teacher, but pain, when reflected upon, does not have to be wasted. Waste occurs when suffering repeats without insight. Insight transforms repetition into learning. Learning changes trajectory. Trajectory matters less at this stage than orientation. Orientation determines how one inhabits the present. Tyson oriented himself toward steadiness rather than excitement, toward listening rather than asserting, toward care rather than control. Care, he discovered, is demanding. It requires attention over time. It resists shortcuts. Shortcuts had defined much of his earlier life. The absence of shortcuts slowed everything down. Slowness revealed nuance. Nuance rarely survives in public memory. Public memory prefers symbols, heroes and villains, rise and fall, redemption or ruin. These narratives simplify consumption, but they rarely capture endurance. Endurance is quiet. Endurance shows up in the willingness to remain engaged without applause, to continue adjusting long after headlines move on, to live responsibly when no one is watching. This endurance became Tyson's unspoken legacy. Not the knockouts, not the scandals, but the sustained effort to live with awareness after intensity. Awareness does not guarantee peace. It guarantees honesty. Honesty can be uncomfortable, but discomfort, when faced steadily, loses its power to dominate. Tyson noticed that many of his earlier struggles stemmed from avoidance, of fear, of vulnerability, of uncertainty. Avoidance had fueled aggression. Aggression had masked fear. Now fear was no longer an enemy, it was a signal. Signals, when heard, guide behavior. He guided his behavior accordingly. He avoided environments that amplified old patterns. He chose engagements aligned with current values. He allowed distance where closeness once threatened balance. This selectivity was not withdrawal, it was discernment. Discernment improves with experience. Experience, once overwhelming, now felt integrated. Integration allowed him to consider how his life might be useful beyond self-reflection, not as a model to imitate, but as a case to examine. A reminder of what happens when raw potential meets insufficient care, when systems exploit intensity without fostering stability. This perspective did not position him as cautionary symbol alone. It positioned him as witness. Witnessing carries responsibility. Responsibility to speak honestly when appropriate, to remain silent when words would distort, to resist narratives that reduce complexity to entertainment. Entertainment demands spectacle. Truth often resists it. Tyson chose truth as he understood it, not absolute, not final, but grounded in lived experience. This truth acknowledged that strength without self-awareness is dangerous, that fear, unmanaged, seeks expression through harm. That redemption is not an event but a practice. Practice continues as long as one lives. Living at this stage felt less like proving and more like participating. Participating in conversations that mattered, in relationships that required presence, in moments that did not demand explanation. Explanation had once felt necessary. Now it felt optional. Optionality is freedom of a quieter kind. It does not thrill. It steadies. As the years ahead stretched, uncertain but less threatening, Tyson no longer sought to outrun his past or enshrine it. He allowed it to exist as foundation rather than burden. Foundations support structures without being visible. Visibility had once been everything. Now it mattered less. What mattered was alignment between inner life and outer action. Alignment reduces conflict. Reduced conflict allows attention to widen. Widened attention perceives connection. Connection counters isolation. Isolation had once fueled extremes. Connection now sustained balance. This balance did not conclude the story neatly. It left edges unresolved, questions unanswered, contradictions intact. But perhaps that is the truest ending available. A life not summarized by triumph or tragedy, but understood as an ongoing negotiation between fear and awareness, power and restraint, intensity and care. If there is a final lesson resting quietly beneath this long arc, it is not about boxing or fame or downfall. It is about what happens when a human being outlives the roles assigned to them and chooses, instead, to listen. Listen to the body. Listen to memory. Listen to the present moment without demanding it be different. Listening does not guarantee certainty, but it creates space, and in that space something rare becomes possible. Not redemption as spectacle, but peace as practice, the kind that arrives softly and stays as long as it is tended.